Welcome to our webinar on middle school philosophy education. We've been doing these series of webinars really for the last year and a half now, and we intend to continue to do so, trying to do 4 to 6 a year. So really glad to see all of you and from many places around the world. It's wonderful. A couple of just housekeeping information. One, will you please make sure that you're muted, and it's best if you can shut your cameras off if you are not the moderator or a panelist during the webinar, and then you can put the cameras back on when we start to take questions. You should feel free to use the chat to communicate. We'll be monitoring that, but when we do start to ask for questions, we would appreciate it if you would use the hand raise function to ask questions rather than the chat, as it becomes cumbersome to try and keep track of that. As you've probably noticed, the webinar will be recorded. And I think that's everything other than some encouragement to consider attending our conference, which was supposed to take place in 2020 and then 2021, and is finally going to happen in person at the University of Washington this June. And we welcome all of you. We're just about to finish putting the program together, and it's really an exciting program, and I hope to see many of you there. And I will turn it over to our board president, Allison Cohen, who will moderate the webinar.
Thank you so much, Jana. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in tonight. It is my pleasure to moderate tonight's webinar.
I helped him pass his test today, so now
it's my pleasure to moderate tonight's webinar. We have such an incredible lineup of guests for you tonight. So I am going to introduce everyone at once. So first up, we have David Shapiro. David Shapiro is a faculty member at Cascadia College, where he teaches philosophy. He has been doing philosophy with young people in and around the Seattle area since he was a graduate student at the University of Washington way back in the 20th century. Not dating you, David, but David is the author and/or co-author of 6 books, including Plato Was Wrong, Footnotes on Doing Philosophy with Young People. David is a member of Plato's board of directors and serves on our program committee. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, David. Alex Chang is currently a middle school English teacher in Michigan. She studied philosophy and education at Carleton College, where she first began teaching philosophy in local schools. As a teacher, Alex continues to develop philosophy lesson plans for middle school students, as well as consider the intersection between philosophy, social emotional learning, and restorative practices. Alex is a member of Plato's Academic Advisory Board and serves on our Advocacy Committee. Welcome, Alex. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Dr. Erik Kenyon is the author of Augustine and the Dialogue and co-author of Ethics for the Very Young. He teaches Latin and Humanities at Friends Academy in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. Erik is a member of Plato's Academic Advisory Board and serves on our Education Committee. He is also on the board of the National Middle School Ethics Bowl. Christina, and I apologize in advance if I mispronounce your last name. Christina Zaccanino is a middle school science teacher, instructional coach, and teacher induction coordinator in Sammamish, Washington, where she also offers philosophy as a flex activity for middle school students. She was a graduate fellow at the Center for Philosophy for Children for 2 years during her master's program in curriculum and instruction at the University of Washington. Thank you so much, Christina. Thanks for joining us. And Dr. Karen Rizak is the founding director of the Ethics Institute at Kent Place School. A leader in primary and secondary school ethics education, Dr. Rizak has been teaching and facilitating ethics workshops for students, parents, faculty, administrators, and private organizations for over 10 years. She is the coach of the national champion Kent Place High School Ethics Bowl team. She has 23 years of experience as an independent school administrator, including director of the middle school at Kent Place and assistant head of school at St. Philip's in Newark, New Jersey. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. And so now we're going to turn it over to our guest, who will take turns talking to us for about 5 minutes each about their experiences doing philosophy with middle school students. So without further ado, David, please start us off.
Hi, thanks so much for having me here today. I'm thrilled to talk about doing philosophy with middle school students, because really that's where I cut my teeth, so to speak, on doing philosophy with young people. My very first experiences doing philosophy with pre-college students was with 5th, 6th, and 7th graders, and especially 6th and 7th graders at a middle school in Seattle. And I was a starry-eyed graduate student, just coming into the classroom, delighted to have the opportunity to work with young people and having the opportunity to just try a bunch of things out. And I would say that for me, and it was really about hearkening back to my own middle school experiences, the guiding principle for me was to really respect the perspectives and ideas of the middle school students. It was my own 7th grade English teacher who first gave me the feeling that what I had to say and what I had to write about mattered, that my ideas mattered. And so I really wanted to come with that perspective to working with middle school students, to kind of meet them as intellectual equals. And so I tried a bunch of things, many unsuccessfully, but I think a real kind of watershed change in my experience with doing philosophy with middle school students happened with an exercise that was actually inspired for me by a colleague of ours in the world of doing philosophy with young people, the novelist, young adult novelist Claudia Mills. She gave a talk at a conference we were at where she talked about using Stuart Little as a prompt for doing philosophy with kids. And like many people, I had loved that book as a child. And, you know, E.B. White is such a classic example of children's literature not really being for children. I mean, it's literature with language that's accessible for young people. And so I was thrilled to to kind of adapt her idea for using Stuart Little to explore philosophy. And she had talked about reading this chapter called The Schoolroom, in which Stuart Little comes into a classroom and is a substitute teacher for a day. And in the middle school classroom that I was working in at that time, the students were really kind of, as middle school students are, kind of squirrely. And so instead of reading to them, I assigned them characters. And so we did this little scene from Stuart Little in which he comes into a classroom as a substitute. And the sort of philosophical topic that they take on is, what are the important things? And so in Stuart Little's classroom, the important things were a shaft of sunlight, a note in music, the back of the way a baby's neck smells if its mother keeps it tidy, and ice cream with chocolate sauce. Those were the important things. So we did this exercise. The students took on these characters and acted out the characters of in the Stuart Little's classroom. And that led to this discussion of what are the important things. And that was an amazing discussion in which students talked about, you know, what were the important things, everything from family and education to video games. It didn't really matter. But then the real shift in that exercise is, and this is what happens in the story as well, is after they figure out the important things, they try to figure out a set of rules that will nurture and sustain those important things. So I use that as a way to have the students develop their own list of rules for doing philosophy for kids. And that turned over the kind of guidance of the classroom to them in a way that was incredibly powerful for me and for them. It had some unintended consequences, and I know I'm almost out of time. one of the unintended consequences that one of their rules was Dave has to bring donuts every week. And that wasn't what I intended, but out of respect for them, I did that the next time I came. And actually that led into a really interesting discussion ultimately about what's fair and who ought to bear the burden of bringing donuts and so forth. And it led into a lot of really interesting subsequent discussions. But again, my real takeaway from all of that and the principle that I think I've hoped to proceed with is really respecting what the young people have to say and meeting them as intellectual equals that way. And I think that's much of what doing philosophy with young people is all about. So I'm happy to talk more about that and some of the unintended consequences that ensued, but I will turn over my 5 minutes now. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks. Alex.
All right, with your permission, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, are you having trouble hearing me again?
No, we can hear you just fine.
Okay.
Yeah, you're all set.
Awesome. Just making sure. My apologies. One moment.
No, it's fine. Share away.
All right. And is that okay for everyone to see?
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay, so thanks so much for having me. I've actually had the opportunity to do philosophy with two groups of middle schoolers from fairly different backgrounds. So the first was when I was teaching 6th grade with Boston Public Schools. And my most recent experience has been this past year at my current middle school in Ypsilanti, Michigan, this time with 8th graders. So both groups were relatively small, about 15 students each. But one notable difference I want to highlight between the two groups is that while my 6th graders were all identified as what we might call those high achievers, the 8th graders I worked with this year were all those who demonstrated a need for academic support. So this difference in background and the context in which I was teaching definitely informed how I presented philosophy to each group. So in Boston, after receiving permission from my principal to go ahead with this philosophy elective, I definitely had the mindset of wanting to expose my students to as much philosophy as I possibly could. I got very excited. And because we met 4 times a week, we were able to actually make our way through mini units on a variety of philosophical topics, some of which are listed here. So the focus for this survey-like course was definitely content. So a typical week with my students might see the students receiving a primary text, such as Plato's Meno, as well as an excerpt from John Locke. And after reading, analyzing, and discussing each text, students would then write a dialogue between Socrates and Locke to demonstrate their understanding of rationalism and empiricism using their own 6th grade language. So this focus was definitely about the content and the ideas of past philosophers. Fast forward to this year, the focus for my 8th grade class this year was less what you might consider academically rigorous. Because the purpose of the class was primarily homework help, we were only able to do philosophy once a week, which meant we had to take on more of a club model. With each week devoted to a different topic. So what we lacked in continuity of content, we made up for in continuity of skills. And so what you see here is a visual aid that I use in my 8th grade philosophy club. And you can see that there are a variety of cognitively oriented skills, such as giving reasons, considering hypotheticals, tools that we would consider essential for doing philosophy. But there are also skills that I would categorize as more social emotional. So over the course of the 5-week club, my colleague from the University of Michigan and I were very intentional about emphasizing the ways philosophy can help us develop listening skills, the ability to consider someone else's perspective and respect that perspective. And it was really cool over the 5 weeks to see how the students would pull on the various skills to address different philosophical topics, whether it was about art or what makes us different from robots. They definitely became more comfortable using things like counterexamples and posing questions, expressing their opinions with reasons. And my colleague and I were very intentional about highlighting those skills as the students used them, as well as praising them when they used them. So while my 6th graders in Boston definitely became well-versed in what we might consider more traditional philosophy, my 8th graders came away with more reflection on their experience participating in philosophical discussions. So the student quoted here highlights the relief that she felt being able to express herself creatively. And as her teacher, it was particularly powerful to see this student express such confidence and joy. This is a student who is very quiet, never raises her hand in class, finds social interactions extremely anxiety producing. So to have her say, hey, this club made me feel more confident, more likely to ask questions and collaborate with others was extremely gratifying. So my two major takeaways from these two experiences were that one, no matter what their background or academic level, students can and will rise to the challenge of philosophical inquiry. You can put text written by Plato and Locke in front of sixth graders and they will make meaning out of it. Likewise, you can have deep philosophical discussions with students who struggle with reading as well. And I think this is what is so special about philosophy, is its ability to be flexible and adaptable to a wide range of students. However, this does take additional planning, intentional planning. And lucky for me, I can draw on the work of those such as David Shapiro and his Plato was Wrong text, whose activities are particularly engaging and interactive. And I think careful planning of interactive activities is particularly important when it comes to middle school students. As a middle school teacher myself, I can safely say middle schoolers tend to be a bit ornery, and in many ways they've become more self-conscious, more wary of judgment, less likely to freely express their opinions in front of their peers than maybe their elementary counterparts. And especially after the pandemic, I've noticed my students lacking some of the basic interactive skills and the ability to participate in healthy and productive discussions. So when I think about philosophy with middle school, I think about the academic benefits, absolutely. But I also think about those social emotional skills that philosophy can develop, the skills that the teenagers need to communicate clearly, effectively, and build those relationships and confidence. So I know my 5 minutes are up, so I'll end it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. That's so interesting, that diversity of experiences that you've had. Very interesting. Next up, Erik.
Okay, does that look right?
Perfect.
Great.
And we can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Okay. So actually, I think a lot of what I have to say dovetails nicely with what Alex was just talking about. So I think as the classicist in this group, I want to talk about teaching from ancient and medieval primary sources. Okay, so just a little bit of context here. When it comes to 4-year-olds, I am definitely down with games, storybooks, art projects. That's the way to go. By the time you get to undergraduates, I think they really should be reading primary sources, in English, ideally whole texts. And that's part of the reason I really like dialogues. When it comes to middle school students, though, they really are in the middle. On the one hand, they're ready to have these really sophisticated conversations. On the other hand, they just want to play. Often you get both of these at once, which is what's so magical about middle school. So I teach humanities, where we do a lot of young adult literature, lots of ethical reasoning kind of conversations. But I also teach Latin, where we have started working in things like this. So what I'm calling primary sources for youth. So I think within the pre-college philosophy world, there's a little skepticism about whether this is a good thing to try. And I think this line of thinking goes, okay, the discussion should be the children's ideas. If you give them historical texts, they're no longer the children's ideas, you're just teaching them content. And there's a way of doing that, but that's not what I'm trying to do. What I want to do is use historical texts themselves as stimuli. And I think this particularly makes sense if you're working within traditions that see philosophy as a kind of spiritual exercise. So the different schools of Greek thought all were trying to get you to think in certain ways, and the different authors wrote accordingly. So what I tried to do is curate that. So taking outtakes that are, a couple pages, which I've been translating into middle school friendly language. I've got some friends kind of tagged to do some stuff out of Arabic and Sanskrit too. As for particular lessons, start out with just general context. Honestly, there's a lot of good stuff on YouTube. A kind of introduction to the particular text, maybe a thought experiment kind of discussion, and then just let the students go off in small groups. Start by reading aloud, which, if it's a Socratic dialogue, is always really entertaining. And along the way, they get embedded questions. So, Republic 1, Polemarchus says, I think that justice is helping friends and harming enemies. So we can just stop there and say, okay, name a situation today when it's considered just to harm bad people. If you can't think of one, give it your best shot and say why it doesn't work. So you get a group of 7th graders together on this, and they start talking about retributive justice and the justice system. And after a while, they're talking about the the school to prison pipeline and systemic racism. So once all this discussion is going, and honestly, this is the first sentence of the outtake, they're then ready to get Socrates' argument that justice can't make people unjust. So stringing this together for the first unit, started with outtakes from Socratic dialogues to raise questions like, what is happiness, what are virtues, and then got Aristotle and some Hellenistic answers to that. As a culmination to this unit, they were told, okay, talk about what are the ideas that each of these people has about the good life, but use them to think critically about your own education. And so that turns up things like this. This was turned in last week. Epicurus believes that you should just hang around and chill. I relax when I'm proud to tell my parents about my grades, but not if I have bad grades. Sometimes chilling makes more stress, and then you have to worry about people finding out. In short, you should just work hard when you have to work hard and hang around when you can. All right, then moving on to 8th grade. My 8th graders are very skeptical to start with, so I figured let's throw some gasoline on the fire and find out what happens. So we had a unit recently on ancient skepticism. So, starting with the paradox of inquiry, and then looking at academic versus Pyrrhonian skepticism as they developed from Stoic and Epicurean ideas. So my hopefully inspirational story is about Sextus and the Cat Earth Society. So Sextus' basic idea is that all conflicting ideas have equal strength. So you should really suspend all beliefs, and that will help you just kind of chill out. So we went through the text and then just like, let's try this out. So here's a random claim. The earth is round. Can you actually know that? So I got them debating, and of course somebody quickly said, well, no, it's not, it's flat. And then they got going back and forth, and being digital natives, they quickly went to Google, at which point somebody discovered the Cat Earth Society, which is a group of people who uses satellite evidence to argue that the world is in fact a cat playing with Australia. So at this point, things got rather heated, as you can see in the picture here. The great thing, though, is that the discussion didn't just stop that day. It actually went on for several weeks, including students who put together PowerPoints that they weren't assigned to do, so that they could work out their arguments on all various sides, including my favorite, if the world is a cat, why am I not allergic? So in terms of reflection on this, students said things like, at first, I feel like I'm just writing gibberish, but after a while, it all comes together and makes sense. And you, Dr. Kenyon, keep giving us things that are too advanced for us, but you believe in us, so we do them anyway. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. Christina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christina. As was mentioned earlier, I teach middle school science at a school here in Sammamish, which is right outside Seattle, Washington. And so I don't do philosophy in my science classroom, but we have a flex period in our schedule where students are able to sign up for different activities that they want to go to. And teachers offer different types of clubs, and different kinds of activities for students to sign up for. So I offer philosophy as a flex activity, which has some really obvious pros and cons. So for example, I don't know who will be signing up for my flex activity from week to week. And so always having different students in our community of inquiry means that we don't always get to build that same sense of community or to make progress over time in the way that we might if we were meeting in a class or more regularly with the same group of students. So I used to facilitate philosophical inquiry with 4th and 5th graders in Seattle public schools. And I would go in once a week or once every other week, and I would watch the students make progress together and kind of decide over time what counted as knowledge and what counted as progress philosophically. I saw their thinking become more abstract and philosophical over time. I saw them learning from one another, becoming better listeners, really learning to listen to one another and kind of build knowledge together in different ways. And that's not necessarily something that I'm able to see with this smaller and kind of more inconsistent group of students that I work with right now. So not only is there not the same opportunity for trust to grow within the community, but there is less opportunity for knowledge to grow and expand across time, or for the method itself to become more defined over time. So the students that I allow to sign up for my flex period are in grades 6, 7, and 8. So that introduces differences in their academic ability, their maturity, cognitive development, since they're in different grade levels. And they also come in with really different backgrounds in philosophy as well. So sometimes I have students who have done philosophy in their elementary schools, and they are used to already writing philosophical papers. And then I have other students who've never done philosophy or even heard the word before. So it introduces that dynamic. And then another interesting thing that I've noticed is that students come into the flex period looking for different things. So some students are looking to show everyone that they are the smartest person in the room. And they see philosophy as an opportunity to do that because they get to just talk about, whatever ideas they have and want to talk about. Some students are looking to debate and see the other people in the room as opponents. Some students come in just curious and wanting to think with other people and learn from others. And then some students come in not knowing why they're there because they had nothing else to sign up for that week, or their friends were going to be there. So again, it just introduces this really interesting dynamic of this group of really diverse people coming into become a community of philosophical inquiry. So one of the things that I think would be helpful in this situation is to start by setting norms, which I know I haven't always done when I have facilitated philosophy in other settings, because I like the students to be able to set those norms or to see the community develop over time. But I think in this setting where the community literally changes from week to week, it can be helpful to talk really explicitly in the beginning about like what the method is, what do we do in philosophy, and have the facilitator be the one that kind of decides that for the group. And we can always, talk about it and interrogate it as a group, but for the facilitator to name that explicitly in the beginning is helpful when you don't have the time and the space for that to develop within the community. I haven't actually done that yet because I do find it really interesting from week to week when I come in to just see what happens, right? I don't know who's going to show up. And so it's always just really kind of fascinating to see how different groups of students interact with each other and with the ideas that come out. So the method that I tend to follow in this model during a flex period is I do a little warm-up activity, I present a stimulus, and then I just open it up to conversation. And so it's this kind of seminar style, really short stimulus that's either a story or a video or a piece of music, and just see what happens and see what the students bring out of that together. Part of that is because I can't plan for who will be there. And so I can't necessarily build on the topics that came out the week before. Some of the really fascinating things for me in doing philosophy in this kind of setting is that I get to see my students who I teach science to in a very different light. And even just seeing who shows up is really interesting. And I get to know them in different ways. It shows me different aspects of who they are and what they're interested in. And most of the time, the students who come are there because they want to be there. So they come open and curious and ready to engage. And so it always leads to a really interesting conversation. Something I've noticed about middle schoolers in particular, since before doing this flex kind of model, I used to work with elementary school students, and I see some big differences between the elementary and the middle school age, kind of similar to what Alex was saying earlier. Middle school students love an opportunity to talk about things that are important to them, just like the elementary school students do, and also to use their imagination to do something that's intellectually stimulating, that isn't being graded or measured. But what I've noticed is that they are a lot more self-conscious and tentative than my elementary students were. So they're a lot more socially minded. They're more interested in middle school and looking good or being accepted socially, and who are their friends, who are they connecting with, who are they not connecting with. Developmentally, that's really appropriate for them. And so they aren't going to as openly share what they're thinking and what they really believe or what they're really curious about compared to elementary school students or high school students. And so that has introduced a really interesting dynamic into philosophy that is really related to their social and emotional skills, like Alex and Erik were saying earlier as well. So the one success story or just interesting story that I wanted to share was, so we played a game. I think this is one of David's activities called the question game, where students build a question collectively. So they go around and everyone says a word, and then the next person adds a word on until they build a question, and they clap to do a question mark. And this group of 6th or 8th graders was having such a difficult time just building a very simple question, like a really basic task. And it was just really interesting to see them try to work together and accept the imperfection of what they were building, the imperfection of the process. And because it really brought out the social dynamic of doing philosophy. So in order to successfully build a question that even just grammatically makes sense, you need to be listening to the people who came before you. You need to be paying attention to the people who are coming after you, and really understanding how we are working through this together. And since these students come in from such different backgrounds, different goals, different ideas of what's happening, and then there's the social aspect, they really struggled. So that created an opportunity for us to reflect on, on that communal aspect, but also like, what does it mean to come to knowledge about something when the knowledge isn't just our own, but when we're in this kind of communal setting. So that was kind of my interesting story with middle schoolers. And I think that is all I had to share. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you. Sorry, I clicked. Thank you. Karen, last but certainly not least.
So good evening, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I've really enjoyed hearing what my colleagues tonight are saying. And what I want to talk about tonight, or have been asked to share with you, is our experience with Middle School Ethics Bowl. And my experience with the High School Ethics Bowl led me to meet Roberta Israeloff, who, as you know, is with the Squire Family Foundation, and her work, of course, with the High School Ethics Bowl. And so one day over lunch, she asked the question, can middle school students engage in ethical dialogue? Do you think that they would ever be able to do what the high school students could do in the High School Ethics Bowl? And I got so excited by her question. And I said, absolutely, positively, yes. I know they can, because we're already doing it at my school. And my school, Kent Place, is a K through 12 school. And so part of the beauty of being in a K to 12 school is that the students in middle school can see what's going on with the students in high school. And so this whole engagement with ethics and ethical thinking and ethical decision-making really began over 10 years ago when I decided to teach an ethics elective in the middle school. And the basis of this ethics elective was really using case studies, because as others have said tonight, it's very difficult for middle school students to talk about their own experience because they fear judgment. So giving students case studies about topics that they're interested in really gives them the opportunity to talk about something that's outside of them or third person. And they're much more willing to share what they think about something. And in the process, they really learn what it is that they value and what's important to them. So that first elective in middle school and talking about case studies, when those students went into the high school, they continued to meet as a club. And then what happened was we learned about the High School Ethics Bowl. And so those now students in high school became involved with the National High School Ethics Bowl. But not to forget about middle school, the students who were in the middle school saw the high school students now engaged in an ethics bowl type situation. And so the middle school students created the Ethics Bowl Junior Club. And I actually presented them with the cases from the national case set and was amazed. I mean, certainly not at a high philosophical level that the high school students are able to engage in conversation, but they hit all the high points. You know, they were able to talk about their reasons why. They were able to ask the right ethical questions. They were able to really engage in listening and in being authentic and in identifying values that are important to them. And so from this Ethics Bowl Junior Club was when I met Roberta. And so we decided to see if it would work and to create a type of competition, though there are issues around a competitive ethics bowl, but an opportunity for schools to come together and to engage in ethical conversation around topics that were of great interest to the middle school students. And so the first New Jersey Middle School Ethics Bowl took place in 2019. And that year we had 8 schools and 14 teams because some schools had more than one team. For example, Kent Place has 2 teams. It grew from there. And of course, because of COVID, we needed to convert the Ethics Bowl into a virtual Ethics Bowl. And I have to credit my colleague, Ariel Sykes, who I know is on this call as well, for her expertise in creating the platform for a virtual bowl. But in those years, we had 12 schools and 20 teams. And now this past year, we had our first National Middle School Ethics Bowl, which involved 18 schools, 26 teams, and 5 states. And as you've already heard, Erik is involved. We do now have a Middle School Ethics Bowl National Committee, and we meet to talk about how we can make, how we can formulate, how we can create an opportunity for middle school students from across the country to engage in dialogue around issues that are really of great importance to them. And so who's eligible to participate? Well, it's middle school students, grades 6 through 8, and each team is comprised of anywhere from between 5 and 7 students. Well, actually, you could have as few as 3 and as many as 7. And though we do find that 8th graders seem to be a little bit more articulate or loquacious than a 6th grader, still the students in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade are able to participate at a very high level. The way that the Ethics Bowl in the middle school is structured is that each of the schools, the students, they receive 6 cases to prepare for the competition. We give them the questions in advance, and I'm going to show you a sample in a moment. We give them the questions in advance so that they're not, taken off guard by an ethical question that they weren't prepared for. And the new structure really aligns with middle school age students. They have a chance to dialogue with each other. They have a chance to dialogue with the judges, and they have a chance to really change their minds, which is part of what is really exciting about the Middle School Ethics Bowl, because they may go in thinking that the most ethical answer to a particular question is this, and by the time they leave, it's that. And they're also given the opportunity to say in what way over the course of the round did their ethical thinking change. And to be able to give middle school students the opportunity to reflect in that way, I think is one of the true strengths of the Ethics Bowl. And we have expert ethicists, educators who serve as judges and who really add to the quality and the depth of the bowl. So I just wanted to show you just very briefly, importantly, these cases were written by not only adults, but also by middle school students, because they like to talk about the things that they're interested in. For example, just this week in our own middle school, the students wanted to talk about cheating in sports, atomic bombs, and trans athletes. So I'm sure that some of those topics are going to appear next year in the Middle School Ethics Bowl case set. But just to show you quickly, For example, case number 1 this year, and again, written by middle school age students, was about a person who was shopping who got too much change. And he had to deal with whether or not he should return the money or keep the money. And the fact that he was, struggling a little bit added to the conversation. So the match question, what, if anything, should Evan do when he realizes the mistake and why? And we give them study questions. And again, we give this to the students and the schools and the coaches in advance. We also offer training for the coaches. If the schools are nearby, we visit and we engage with the coaches and the students so that students feel comfortable and the teams feel comfortable when they come to the competition. And they have a tremendous amount of fun. Just one more. This was choices in the workplace. This is about a healthcare worker who overhears a conversation that was disturbing to her. And the conversation was had by her supervisor. So she's wondering, what, if anything, should she do? So these are some of the ways that we get middle school students to engage. And I certainly hope that many of you will decide to become involved with the Middle School Ethics Bowl next year. We hope to have it again as a national ethics bowl and perhaps regionally done, because it would be hard for everybody to come to New Jersey. So thank you. And I think we're going to open it up for questions now for everyone.
Yes, so before we do that, I wanted to sort of open this up to a panel discussion. That was wonderful, Karen. Thank you so much. The Ethics Bowl is just, students love participating in the Ethics Bowl. For those of you who don't know, I am a high school teacher. I teach primarily seniors in an AP government class. And so my hat is off to each and every person here who teaches middle school. I don't know if I could handle it anymore. I don't know. So I am in awe of the work that you do. So before we open it up for questions to the group, I wanted to sort of pose a question to our panelists, or a group of guests. And I'm thinking that a lot of the people joining us tonight either have a middle school philosophy program in place, or maybe are thinking about starting a middle school philosophy program, but they might be concerned about some of the challenges in starting that. So I wanted to open that question up to the group. What are some of the challenges that you've encountered in bringing philosophy to middle school students? And what are some of the things that you've done to mitigate those challenges? And do we have a volunteer to start? If not, I'm just going to pick on someone. Karen, was that? Yeah, Karen, please start us off.
One of the challenges that I have found is that people, the students and the teachers, are really intimidated by philosophy. And I know that that's the whole purpose of the organization. And so it's almost a fear. And so bringing philosophy to middle school at a larger scale involves bringing the teachers on board. And I have found that that is a big challenge. And so we've tried to figure out a way, again, I think bringing ethics into the middle school and then advancing into philosophy. And I'm not saying that middle schoolers can't do philosophy. I'm talking about it from the perspective of the educators. I think that that has proven to be an easier entryway to get teachers in different disciplines to incorporate ethics and philosophy into their disciplines, into their courses of study, because they find, again, that it's not an add-on, it's an add-in, and it's a way to really stimulate conversation. So that has been a challenge, and we've addressed the challenge by helping teachers learn how to be facilitators of conversations, and that they don't need to know all the answers. They just need to know how to ask the right questions.
Yeah, and I think that's key. It's that part of what we see is the mission of this organization is providing teachers the tools so that they can be comfortable having these conversations with students in an atmosphere where they might not otherwise be comfortable sort of opening these questions up to a group of students. Someone want to, Alex?
Yeah, I can build on that a little bit. In my most recent school, I definitely received maybe not pushback, but definitely some skepticism. And I think it stemmed from my colleagues and administrators just not really knowing what philosophy is. In fact, there were many times when they thought I was saying psychology, and I had to keep correcting them in emails. No, but it's philosophy, it's something different. And the kids who found out they were going to be part of this experience came in freaking out because they thought I was bringing therapists in to work with all of them, and we're going to do psychology and pick their brains. Like, no, 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 we are going to pick your brains, but by doing it with philosophy, and here's what's different. But I think because I was a teacher or I am a teacher at the school, they knew me, they knew my work as an English teacher. So that trust was there. And then what I did during the actual course of the sessions with the students is I had another colleague, a math teacher who had been at the school for a long time, join us and participate in the activities and act as a co-teacher. And she had never had experience with philosophy either. But over the course of our time, she really started to, I think, gain an appreciation for what philosophy was doing for our students. And she also told me one day that she actually took one of the activities that we had done with our 8th graders and did it with her kids at home. So it was starting to have that impact in her personal life as well. And I think that, I don't want to make it seem as if it's an infiltration activity, but it is kind of like that, in that when you get at least one person who your school community trusts on board and witnessing the magic of philosophy in a middle school classroom, it's much easier to gain that that buy-in.
That's it, right? I mean, as soon as someone experiences that, they're in. Erik.
Yes, I think I might have lucked out. So I'm at an independent school in the progressive tradition founded by Quakers. So the faculty, the admin, the parents they all love this. So I think the challenges I've had have been more just like logistical. So if you get down to it, when we're doing philosophy, we're really talking about like talking, reading, and writing. And my students are really good at talking. When it came to reading, what I was finding out was that, at least doing primary sources, what was tripping them up wasn't the content, it was the conventions of formal translations. So just commercially available translations a lot of the time sound more stiff and old-timey than like the Greek and Latin that they're being translated from. So at first I just started altering translations. And then when I find the time, I've just been doing them from scratch. And so now that, they're still confused, but they're at least confused about things that are useful. And I think on the writing part, we've talked a lot about sort of development. And when it comes to writing, middle schoolers have a way of being all over the place. So for some of them, it was really a struggle, I think, particularly when philosophy or philosophical writing gives you so much freedom. So sometimes there's accuracy of like, well, no, Epicurus didn't say that. But then just you can do whatever you want to with it. And I think that sort of intimidated some people. But what I ended up doing was just giving them second chances, and we would rewrite and we would do writing in class, and just kind of more time than I initially thought they would need. And I'm not gonna lie, in a few cases, it was like pulling teeth. But honestly, a year later, like the progress that I've seen from some of them, like honestly, one student who would turn in an essay exam that was just a question, like a sentence with a bunch of errors, the next year was turning in 3-page things that were carefully structured. And like, so I think just going through it, he finally got his writing caught up with his thinking. And I think the philosophical process of just going back and forth really helped. And I think it's made students' writing quite a lot stronger, even if it took a lot of goodwill and a lot of work to get there.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something you said, and David, I'm gonna call you out. I'm gonna pick on you, and that is just that one of the challenges might be sort of adults persistently underestimating what kids are capable of. And I was wondering if you did find that a challenge, and if so, what has your experience been?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I saw that as a challenge, and but maybe there's a kind of analog to that, and it actually connects with Erik's lovely slide of the middle schoolers on their tricycles being middle schoolers. Because for me, often the challenge has been in the classroom, not that they're not enough into it, or not that they're too into it, that the that the level of excitement and my ability to sort of be a good classroom manager around that has made it difficult. It's I keep thinking of one of the first years I was doing philosophy with young people, I was at a 6th grade classroom, and the discussion was so lively that the teacher from next door came in and asked us what was going on and could we please keep it down. So to me, that's been the most pressing challenge. And again, it connects again to what Erik had said, and what Christina was alluding to as well, is just kind of having a container for the enthusiasm in a way that keeps it philosophical and keeps it from turning into middle school chaos. And a certain amount of chaos is great. I'm all for a certain amount of chaos, but constructive chaos. So I'm not exactly sure I answered your question about, Allison, about adults underestimating young people. I think underestimating the enthusiasm with which middle school students may sometimes engage with these ideas is what I've really found.
Excellent. Thank you.
If I could just jump in here, something I'm noticing in this conversation is that there is this kind of spectrum in middle school from, content heavy, highly formal analytical thinking, right, to just giving a stimulus and seeing what the kids do with it, which can be more of that like chaotic kind of everyone's excited to think together type of environment. And I think that really is something that is unique to the middle school age because they are in such an in-between space. And so I think for anyone who's thinking about starting a philosophy program in middle school, like that's just a really good question to think about. Like, what are your goals and who are your students and what do you want them to get out of this? Because both sides and everything in between on the spectrum is really valuable, but I think it's important to define what the purpose of the program is and how you'll get there. Because I think training teachers, to go back to what Karen was saying, training teachers in more of like a P4C stimulus type of philosophy is really different from training teachers to do something more content focused. So it's just something to think about.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And that actually anticipates the next question that I wanted to ask everyone. What sort of training do you think a teacher needs to be able to engage in this kind of activity with middle school students?
Well, first aid first. That was a joke.
Yeah.
I could jump back in. So I think it really does depend on what the goals are for the program. But I do tend to think that if it is a more P4C stimulus-based kind of approach that you're going for, then engaging the teachers in their own community of philosophical inquiry will be probably one of the most effective ways of showing them, really introducing them to what this type of thinking and talking is, and then eventually what the facilitator role will look like. Because I think I have 2 degrees in education and I've only ever been a teacher, I have these teacher instincts that I really had to kind of push aside when I started facilitating philosophy, because there's just a very different emphasis in a science classroom or a content-based classroom. We are kind of trained to have a clear learning objective and backwards plan. How are you going to meet the objective? How are you going to know your students got there? Very evidence-based, and facilitating just a conversation about what students think is really different. So I think having teachers experience it themselves is the most effective way, and then kind of reflecting on the value of that. And then something else that I think would be interesting is thinking about how that type of philosophical inquiry actually does meet standards, like Common Core state standards. And I think that's a connection that can happen eventually, but you really need to understand first what the inquiry is before you can get there, so that you're not imposing your preconceptions on it.
If I could just build on that, it's really interesting, Christina, to hear that you had to push back against some of your teacher self instincts when doing philosophy, because I feel like when I did philosophy with both my 6th and 8th graders, I really leaned on my teacher tricks, I guess. I think one thing I try to emphasize both with teachers that I work with doing philosophy and just my own practice is that as teachers, we really do have a wealth of strategies that can work in a philosophical community. Some of the things like pacing, knowing when a student needs to do a turn and talk as opposed to a whole class discussion, knowing when the activity needs to be more interactive or more quiet and independent reflection. And so I think that, having teachers feel empowered to use what they know about their students and adapt their area of expertise and see what's already philosophical about what they're doing and enhance it, I think can be really powerful as well.
Great. I have one question that someone asked me in a private chat that I wanted to throw out to the group. Did any of you have experience conducting these conversations in an online environment? And if so, can you share some insights about how to facilitate any tricks that worked for you in facilitating these conversations in a virtual environment? Erik, I thought I saw your hand up.
Okay. So the primary source stuff that I showed you was developed, well, in a really ridiculous hybrid where some of us were outside, some of us were at home. So it's native to Google Doc, and we had a lot of breakout rooms when the Wi-Fi was working. So I think the text actually worked well as a scaffold. And I think maybe kind of to get back to what you were saying, Christina, I think I've got a different training, so I don't have all this teacher stuff to fall back on, but I think my own kind of training as a class assistant or philosopher, I like the idea that the history of philosophy is still there because it's useful for thinking about today. So I guess getting to the question of, what kind of training do you need? I think this idea that, there's delivering content and then there's just having a stimulus, like that seems like a false dichotomy to me. So in terms of at least, the kind of thing that I'm trying to do, I've been tapping people to come in and like, hey, can you curate this and have some questions? And I think, once we get that built up, the sorts of P4C methodology that you're talking about, Christina, I think that's all you need, because in the end of the day, like they're in 7th grade, they don't actually need to know what Epicurus thought. But hey, there's a whole bunch of like useful stimuli, and 20 years from now, they'll probably remember like, oh, I really hate Socrates, or I really love Socrates, or like, Sextus is crazy.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have experience in an online or virtual environment? Tips and tricks to share that made it successful?
I would say the chat box is your friend. I have used the chat box for all sorts of things like surveys, waterfall chats. There's a ton of really cool ways of kind of just getting a gauge of what the students are thinking in a really quick way. And then that can create a foundation to go into some of that deeper thinking. So that's one of my big tips.
And the poll feature, that's always good, having them vote on questions that they want to discuss as a class. The other thing I did that's just so simple, but the kids loved it, is just in a Google Doc, they would generate questions about a particular prompt and then drag and drop stars to pick the questions that they wanted to share and discuss as an entire class. So sometimes it's the easiest hacks that are most engaging for students. There are a couple questions that have popped up in the chat. I would encourage people to ask their questions aloud and raise hands, but I also don't want to miss the questions that have already been submitted in the chat. Dan Barnett, you had a question. Dan, did you want to ask yours to the group? If not, I can read it out loud.
Yes.
Thanks, Dan.
Have you had experience, if you talk about really sensitive issues like race, sexuality, gender, and so forth, thinking about when kids go home, what their parents might hear when they ask their children, well, what did you do in school today?
Karen?
So I can answer this question both as someone who teaches ethics and who is a school administrator. So I think it's very, very important that the parents understand, especially when we talk about sensitive issues. And it's why we do a lot of parent workshops along with all the things that we do with the students, that the parents need to understand that a lot of what the students talk about, that what we talked about with the students, is based on the values that they get from home. There are, if a student says something in middle school that's totally off base, it's totally off base, and you don't allow everything to be spoken about. But having kids discuss issues that are really relevant to them in a way that encourages civil discourse, in a way that encourages people feeling safe. You've created a safe climate, a safe environment in the school that goes beyond the classroom. Again, this is why parents are brought in, and also given the opportunity to engage in ethical or philosophical conversation, so that they know we are not pontificating, we are not advocating, but that we are encouraging students to talk about things in an age-appropriate manner, about topics that are of great importance to them. If there's something that's said in a class that's a red flag, we notify the families ahead of time so that we're if it's a serious thing. But as I said, we talk about trans athletes, we talk about racism, we talk about gender, we talk about the issues that are happening in the world, because this is what the students want to talk about. But once you've established a climate in the classroom where it's a safe environment, it's a mutually respectful environment, it's an age-appropriate environment, then I think the parents can appreciate the fact that students are engaged in conversation that gets them to think and that is not inappropriate.
Yeah, that trusting environment, right? I mean, that's just, it's so important to cultivate that. Alex, I think, did you want to add something to that? I thought. No, I was seeing things.
Just
Great.
nodding
Erik.
in agreement.
Yeah, Erik.
I think I'll second everything Karen just said, and maybe add one thing where we talk a lot about politics and current politics. So like right now, I've got a unit going in humanities on censorship. And so we talked about cancel culture and censoring curricula and regulating the internet. And I think just in so much American politics, there's so much people talking past each other. So I think before getting in, not just sensitive, but like politically hot button issues, laying out some general principles of ethical reasoning really helps. So at the beginning of the year, we talked about the difference between intent and consequence. So once you get into like this stuff about racism and just like what is a racist, and one person is thinking, well, it's somebody who means bad, like a Klansman, and somebody else is thinking about, oh, you're participating in structures that you didn't ask for. These are very different things, but one person's thinking this and they're saying that, and they're just not communicating. So we work our way up to all that political stuff. And then once we're there, it's like, okay, well, using all of this framework, we can figure out that, well, none of these people are stupid. They all have some point. Let's at least try to assume goodwill and go from there.
Yeah, great. Yeah. And using those philosophical concepts to get there, right? The difference between intent and consequences. I love that. Yeah. Great. Fran, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. I'm just gonna, oh, I can't be seen. Okay.
We can
Yeah.
hear you just fine. Excellent.
Sure. My first question is kind of bigger, and my second one I think is just much more discreet. The bigger question is, has anyone tried to do these kinds of classes within a religious framework or a religious environment, like a school or just like a synagogue or mosque? And have there been, and if you have, or if you know people who have done it, what have the different challenges been, or what has the like exciting features been? That's my first question. Maybe I'll just start with that.
I currently teach in a Catholic school where I do philosophy. And what's interesting is that my Catholic school is only about 50% Catholic. So we do have a very diverse student body in terms of faith. And so it creates this interesting dynamic where we are allowed to talk about faith and religion and spirituality, but we are not necessarily dominated by one specific view over another. There's a lot of diversity there. And so it just, I think, is good ground actually for philosophical discussion around religious topics and religiosity in general. And then also I am currently working with a Catholic diocese. I'm consulting a little bit with them to create standards for their religion curriculum that includes philosophy in their religion curriculum as a way of engaging with the faith, as like a starting point for those kinds of faith questions that are, because they're so connected. Yeah, that's been an interesting process as well.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I guess, yeah, if nobody else wants to weigh in on that.
Well, your second question, I think that's a great one. I think people would love to have just some very practical, like, very practical. What are some of the best prompts? What is the best prompt you've used with your students?
Yeah, that was my second question. Thank you.
Somebody want to start us off? David, I know you have your dilemma is going to be choosing which one.
Yeah, I was a little unclear about the question. Was the question related generally to any prompts, or was it prompts to explore philosophy in a religious context?
Oh, well, I would love that, but I think probably that's not general enough. So I'll just go with like just
maybe here's one that
prompts you've used.
Here's one that maybe touches on both.
Okay.
The children's story Yellow and Pink by William Steig is a wonderful story featuring two wooden stick figures who essentially articulate a kind of evolutionary concept of existence, how existence came into being, how humans came into being, and the design argument for God's existence. And it's a way to even in a secular setting, in a school setting, to explore those two perspectives in a manner that's I think is in keeping with a philosophical perspective. Both of the characters in the story articulate quite nicely their perspective, and that leads to wonderful discussions about how did things come into being. What happened before the Big Bang is a question that came up when I did that reading with sixth graders, and that led into really rich philosophical discussions. So yeah, I would just Yellow and Pink. I'll give a plug for that by William Steig is a wonderful prompt for exploring questions about the nature of how things began.
Thank you.
I can share two prompts. One is the prompt that I used to start off with my sixth graders. When my first time ever doing philosophy with middle schoolers, I showed them a red cube, just a simple wooden cube. I think I stole it from a math teacher's counting box. And I asked the students, what is the color red? And that was the only question we discussed that day. And whether the color red existed independent of the cube. And as the students got into it, talking about, well, of course it does, and saying, well, it's, a red is the color and you can take it off the cube, but if it's off the cube, then it's on paper, then isn't that red on paper? And eventually we got into talking about Plato's forms and saying whether that was nonsense and whether we should just lean on the scientific explanation. But they really got into it. And then all it took was a single red cube. Another prompt or activity that I did this year with my eighth graders, when we were trying to intuit the importance of different perspectives, is showing students the Gestalt switches, which are the duck rabbit images, or the old lady, young lady images, if you're familiar, and having the students just first say, okay, what's the first thing you see? Then having them show each other the other way, and having them think about two questions in relation to the activity. One, what's the importance of being able to use other people's perspectives to see the whole picture, the importance of listening in order to gain that different perspective that you wouldn't have been able to see had you not talked to someone. And also, of course, what I liked is just questioning our senses and reality in general, and our ability to see something. So again, all it took was a quick Google search on Google Images, Gestalt switches, showing them the images and saying, what do you see? And that led to a fairly deep philosophical discussion.
I just build on that real quickly. Contemporary versions of that are really powerful prompts are, the blue dress, is that dress blue one? We had amazing discussion about that. And then the Yanny Laurel audio one, same kind of thing, just perceptions of reality, and as simple prompts like that lead to a full hour's discussion.
I think one of my favorite stimuli that I can always fall back on, no matter who the group is and across lots of different grade levels, is knowledge versus beliefs, and just having students fold a piece of paper in half, make a list of 3 things they know and 3 things they believe, and then having conversations about, well, what is the difference between knowing and believing based on this? What is knowledge? What is belief? And that can just generate so much, and it's so simple. And there are a lot of examples like that, like wants versus needs, like anything where you can kind of compare and contrast 2 similar concepts is really great for middle schoolers.
For me, I would say, we really ground a lot of our conversations with the students, again, on things that are happening in life. And so one of my favorite questions is, just because we can, should we? And we usually use that question in relation to different innovations that are happening in the world, that, there's a different one every day. Or, even today, one of the discussions was in New Jersey. Today was the first day for legalized recreational marijuana, the sale of. And so just because we can, should we? And what would be, how do we think? How do we think about that short-term, long-term impact on society? So that's my favorite prompt.
I just shared a link in the chat to my list of primary sources for youth. I'll maybe plug one of them. There's this piece from Antiquity from Prodicus the Sophist called The Choice of Heracles. So it's basically the young Heracles who has to choose between virtue and vice. It's not the heaviest hitting thing, but it introduces ideas like, what's a virtue? And it's also been really influential. There's all kinds of paintings, and even Bach wrote a cantata based on this for the birthday of an 11-year-old prince. So that can be a kind of fun, mythology, music, art crossover.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Colin, you had a great question. Do you mind sharing that with the group?
No, not at all. Hi, everybody. So I have talked with a number of middle schools about the way that they might start implementing a philosophy program or get into the ethics bowl. And the concern has been expressed a number of times that particularly in like really diverse public school settings, that this is going to be serving only the students who are already served best by schools, students who are more affluent, students from households where there are advanced degrees. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit about how you make sure that your programs and discussions are inclusive of students who may not have had the opportunity to have those conversations and from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds.
David, yeah, please start us off.
Yeah, I'll just give a little plug for the UW Center for Philosophy for Children, now PLATO. I mean, over the last 20 years, we've been very intentional about going into schools that are more diverse, that are underrepresented students. Colin, you're absolutely right, though. I mean, it's a lot easier, I think, to get philosophy for kids off the ground in schools that have more resources. But I would say that being really intentional about choosing schools that have more diverse communities, and the key to that, I think, is always by going through individual teachers, not principals initially. So our strategy has always been to make connections with individual teachers in schools that we want to work with, that that serve students who tend to be underserved. I can't say that's all, it's not always been successful, and it's often the better resource schools that have time for it, and the less resource schools that are being driven by testing mandates and things like that, and not having time for doing philosophy with kids. But I just think a commitment to students who need who really need philosophy is the only way to make that happen. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say it's it happens automatically, or that it's always been successful that way. But recognizing the challenge that you identify, and intentionally working against that challenge, I think is the only way to go about that.
Colin, your concern was exactly the kind of tension and maybe guilt I felt after working with my students in Boston. It was with all the students who were like my high achieving students. So when I came to Michigan, I said, I really want to try to reach the students who wouldn't be identified by others as being able to do philosophy. And that's why I intentionally chose this academic enrichment class to do philosophy with. And the way that I was able to kind of swing it with both the administrators and with the students was two ways. So with the administrators, when I said, hey, I want to do philosophy with my students who are failing my class, the way I convinced them was, yes, it'll help them with your academics, but listen, these kids are sad. These kids are struggling. It's really hard to be a teenager right now. And I really do believe the activities I have planned for these students are going to make them happier, healthier children. So I really emphasized the social emotional benefits I thought philosophy could bring. And that opens it up, because beyond academic ability, every kid needs that experience in the classroom. And I think that makes it a more inclusive experience. And then with the kids who are like, what is this philosophy, psychology, therapy thing you're forcing on us? I framed it as games. I said, you know what, you're going to come in once a week and we're going to play some games. And eventually they realized the games they were playing were philosophical in nature. But because they didn't necessarily hear the word like critical thinking and philosophy, it felt a little bit more comfortable. And then I was like, hey, you just gave a counterexample. You just consider a hypothetical. Look at you, you're a philosopher. And I think that's what contributed to their eventual confidence.
Colin, I think in my experience facilitating philosophy in really diverse groups of students, I could kind of see the way that students bring in their different cultures or different ways of speaking and being with one another. And for me, it's always just been really important to know who my students are and where they're coming from, and the ways that they might be engaging and interacting based on where they're coming from and what their funds of knowledge are. I actually wrote my master's thesis on this. What counts as legitimate participation in a community of philosophical inquiry, and who gets to decide that, right? So like as a facilitator, I think we play a really important role of not just highlighting the students who are really great at logical thinking or making counter arguments, but really welcoming and encouraging every way of thinking, and just meeting students where they are, and kind of, it's really fascinating to watch them decide together, like what is an acceptable thought, and why. And I think that is kind of inherently responsive to all the cultures that students bring in with them.
Fantastic.
So it's been really great for me to get involved in the middle school ethics bowl with Karen and Roberta and Ariel and this really great team. And I mean, we've been worrying quite a lot about this, that we don't want it to be all independent schools. And so this last year, something that we've really kind of dug down in is just like, all right, we've been making the cases. Now we're going to make teach or coach training materials, because, you can't depend on having people with ethics degrees, as teachers. So we've got a bunch of stuff together. COVID kind of forced us to make this beautiful online thing, and now we have it. So I think we're at a point where we're going to start trying to scale up. We've been talking about getting different regional bowls going, thinking about different funding models, like how can we pay people working in the public school to be coaches. But yeah, I mean, it's a bunch of hard questions, and most of it at this point is logistical. But if you want to be on the committee, we'd be happy to have you.
Excellent. And there is one person who had their hand up. We have time for one more quick question.
Yes, hi, thank you. So in the initial presentations, it seemed to me there was reference to primary source material, if that's the right characterization. Leaving aside that at least the few names that were cited tended to be Western philosophers, not from the rest of the world. In the responses to prompts, to suggested prompts, and in the responses to how does one promote discussion in a diverse context, not just in a narrow demographic. There has been effectively no, at least I have not ascertained any reference to primary sources. It's more about topics, about meaty topics that deserve to be discussed and that may be interesting for kids to discuss. So I'm curious, how do you all view the intent of philosophy? Is it to promote discussion and thought around various topics and to clarify and make more rigorous and methodical thinking on the part of the kids? Or is it imparting knowledge of, the philosopher kings who came earlier or who may be existent now? I mean, obviously it could be both, but it seems to me, especially when one is thinking of middle school students, that one route may be more effective than another. But I'm curious as to what your thinking and feelings are.
All right, I guess I'll jump in. So if I had more than 5 minutes before, I would have given you the medieval part of this curriculum too. So I mean, my kind of dissertation works on Augustine, so I've got a lot of stuff on North Africa. I've been really intentional about bringing in Arabic, both Muslim and Jewish philosophers, showing that sometimes the road from Greece to Rome goes through the Middle East and North Africa. The Eastern philosophy, it's really not my specialty, although I've got a friend who is a kind of world-class Sanskrit expert, and she's working on some translations of things. I've got another friend who has a book coming out shortly on medieval women philosophers, and so she's going to put some of these things together for me. So at least in working from primary sources, I don't really think I get the Plato reference in Philosopher Kings, but I think part of it too it's not so much the great individuals as cultures. And at least the way that I like to approach Greek and Roman studies, it's not, oh, the glory that was Greece. There was a bunch of people living on the Mediterranean that were all in each other's business for centuries and centuries. And we're still kind of living with the fallout from that. So let's try to get understanding the kind of big contours of history in the big picture. And along the way, we're going to play with some fun, like wacky stuff, and that will spark a bunch of discussions and kids can have their own ideas. But yeah, I think the more different traditions we can bring in, the better. And that's something I hope to work on in the coming years.
I think my thoughts on this question has shifted. I think when I first started doing philosophy with middle schoolers, I was very much of the mind that, I was 2 or 3 years out of my undergrad experience of being a philosophy major. And I was like, I just want to share all of my philosophical stuff with my kids because I loved it and I want them to love it. And so, as I said, I was very focused on making sure that they understood what the greats knew before they formed their own thoughts. That's kind of what I wanted to do then. Now that I've grown as a teacher and grown as a teacher doing philosophy with middle schoolers, I've started shifting my thinking more towards, okay, it is less about knowing what Descartes thought or knowing what Plato thought, and more about how do we engage and hone specific thinking skills through the course of philosophical discussion. There's a fantastic book by Dr. Philip Cam, which I kind of just have as my Bible next to my computer to draw on. And he really goes through each, what he calls, I think he uses the word toolbox of thinking skills, and talks about how you can specifically grow that skill with students using different learning activities, and then how you can incorporate them into more specific discussions about content questions. And so you have the skills that you use in the course of philosophical questions, and then there are philosophical questions that lend themselves more easily to using those skills. And it's about finding that particular marriage between skill and prompt that I think is the work of the facilitator for middle school philosophy.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. And Alex, there was a request in the chat if you would mind sharing the title of that book. Just kind of throwing that in the chat, the title of the book that you referenced. Excellent. Thank you so much, Joy, for that question. That was a great question. So now as we are wrapping up, thank you all so much for joining. It was my absolute pleasure to moderate tonight's webinar. And I am going to turn it back over to Jana. Jana, thanks.
I just want to thank everyone for coming. It's been such a pleasure to listen to the panelists. Let's kind of give them a, virtual round of applause. Thank you for spending your time with us. And I also want to put in the chat a couple of resources on the PLATO site that might be helpful to people. One is our toolkit, which has a lot of resources for teachers and educators and parents to use for inspiring philosophical conversations with children. And there's also a web page about specifically doing philosophy with elementary, middle, and high school students with some very specific information and resources for middle school students. So I hope that is helpful to you all. And thank you again for spending your time with us, and hope to see many of you in June in Seattle at our conference. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the evening.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.